my name is Jonathan, and this is how I restored my childhood ERTL Mavis. I've been a Thomas the Tank Engine fan practically since birth. Some of my first toys were these ERTL Thomas trains. I grew up in the 90s and 2000s when Shining Time Station was still on TV. We had the model series and great toy lines like the Wooden Railway and ERTL. This is my childhood toy. Even though it's in rough shape, it's one of the last ones I still have, and I really wanted to restore it back to former glory. I've seen some excellent wood and ERTL custom videos online, but no ERTL restorations to this extent. This is a step-by-step video of how I brought my ERTL Mavis back to life. I hope you enjoy it. So the first step in this process was to select a donor vehicle to get parts from. My original Mavis needed some new buffer beams, and the original face had been used by one of my brothers in a kit bashing project years prior. So I selected a spare Mavis from a lot that I had won online several years prior, and I began to disassemble that donor vehicle. I needed those buffer beams and the face for my original Mavis, and so once I drilled through the rivets, I was able to separate the chassis from the metal shell and then gain access to the buffer beams and to the face. There was a lot of trial and error in this early stage of the process. I learned that gloves were an absolute must because the metal shavings get everywhere. Once I got the buffer beam off, getting the face off was relatively easy because it's actually held in with clips. So some needle nose pliers made easy work of getting the face removed from the shell. And so after that, I had all the spare parts I needed to begin my restoration of Mavis. From there, my next step was to disassemble the original Mavis, and I had refined my techniques from the donor vehicle. I would need to drill holes once again into the rivets to gain access to the shell, and at this point I decided that I would use a piece of cardboard to collect the metal shavings. I got a better clamp system, and I was able to drill through the rivets relatively easy. Some ERTL models have screws instead of rivets, which makes this process a lot easier. However, with this specific model, they do have rivets, and so I had to get a specific drill bit to drill into the rivets, starting with a smaller drill bit and working my way up to a drill bit that was the same size as the head of the rivet, but not larger than the hole that was in the chassis. Now, when I disassembled all these pieces, I accidentally broke a corner off of one of the cow catchers, but a little bit of super glue made that cow catcher go right back together. So I was very happy about that because I really wanted to use as many original parts as I could in this restoration. So once I got these pieces disassembled, it was time to move on to the next step in this restoration process. It was time to prep the shell for paint removal, and the first step was to use my Dremel to shave down the sharp edges that were produced from drilling through the rivets. I originally thought about drilling holes in these posts and using screws to reattach the chassis, but I decided against that method. However, it was still a good idea to go ahead and smooth out those sharp edges. I also straightened out the side plates with a pair of pliers. The next step in the process was to put the metal shell in some paint stripper. I wanted to take the metal shell down to the bare metal so that when I applied the paint it would have a smooth surface and a smooth finish. But when you use paint stripper, be sure you wear a mask and gloves and some safety glasses, and be sure you're doing this in a well-ventilated area. While I was waiting for that paint stripper to do its work, I used multiple attachments on my Dremel to get rid of some of the debris that was caught in the cow catchers, and I let the cow catcher and chassis soak in some soap water for a while and then gave it a good polish. I also cleaned off the wheels, all in preparation for reassembly. The paint stripper was very effective, and I honestly loved the way it looked as is. I honestly thought about just putting some clear coat on it and leaving it the way it was, but I decided to go ahead and continue with the original plan. I wanted to test fit everything before painting just to make sure everything fit just right. And as I test fit the pieces, I discovered that there's actually a front and back to the chassis. The wheels are closer to the cow catcher on the cab side than they are on the front side. Once I figured that out, everything fit together perfectly, so I was confident that it was time to paint the metal shell. The next step in the process was to paint the shell. I wanted this to be as smooth and professional of a job as possible, so I elected to use spray paint since I don't have an airbrush. I used a Rust-Oleum black gloss. It was a paint and primer combo, and it's really important to apply this spray paint very carefully because it's very easy to overdo it and create puddling with this spray paint. So if you decide to do this, be sure to follow the instructions on when to apply second coats and be careful. The next step in the process was to paint the details, and I actually used my donor model to do a little experimentation. And then I started painting on the actual restored Mavis. I hand painted the handlebars, and this is actually Railway Series accurate. So this is not something that was an original feature of the ERTL Mavis toy. However, I thought it made it look really cool. So I hand painted those details, and then I also painted the access doors on the side plates white. This is not something that they did in the Railway series or the Model TV series, but I thought it made it look really cool. I also hand painted the yellow stripes on the front, and the only reason I was able to do that was because there are actually grooves on the front, so it made it easy to keep those lines perfectly straight. This process took a lot of time, and it requires a lot of patience. The next step in the process was lettering and decals. I really wanted this to be a professional looking restoration, so I knew I would have to print out the letters. Originally I attempted to hand paint the stripes on the back of the cab. I made some homemade stenciling, but ended up deciding that it was not going to have the clean look that I wanted. So I ended up looking online, and I eventually found this user on DeviantArt that had created some awesome graphics of Mavis, and so I printed these out, scaled them to the Mavis ERTL model, and cut them out. I also went on Microsoft Word, found a font that I liked, made a black background, printed the lettering off, and then cut these out as well. I scaled them to the Mavis model, and once I cut all these pieces out, I made sure that they were scaled correctly, and then the next step was to glue them on. I used some of my wife's craft glue and very sparingly put some on the backs of the decals and the windows on the front and the stripe portion on the back of the cab. I used some tweezers to apply these decals. This is definitely a step in the process you have to take your time with. Once I had all of my decals on the Mavis model, it was time to put a clear coat. I used a satin coat to help to bring down some of the over glossiness from the first coat. The next step in the process was to paint the cow catchers and the chassis. And if I had any step to do over again in this entire restoration, I would have spray painted the cow catchers and chassis. However, I originally decided to hand paint them with an acrylic paint. And while the result wasn't bad, I feel like it would have been better and cleaner if I had just spray painted it to begin with. The next step was to paint the face. I let the face soak in soap water for a couple of hours and got any residual grime and grit off of the face. Then I went about painting it. The ERTL Mavis face very much mirrors the model TV series face, and they did a disservice to it because in the original Railway Series illustrations, Mavis actually has makeup. She has eyebrows, eyelashes. And in the model series, the TV series, they didn't do any of that, which is ironic because another female character in the series, Daisy, she actually had no makeup on her Railway Series illustrations. But then when it came to the TV show, they completely overdid it with the makeup to try to make it obvious that she was a female character. So I took my custom Mavis face, I gave her larger eyebrows, eyelashes, lipstick, painted the teeth in, just tried to give it a more Railway Series accurate look. And at that point, I had all of my parts ready for final assembly. Next up was final assembly. I had all of my parts cleaned and painted. Again, I was very happy that I was able to use almost all original parts except for the buffer beams and the face. Everything went together very smoothly. I got the wheels in and then the buffer beam, and then it was time to put the face on. This was actually a little more challenging than I anticipated because the clips were very stiff and hard to get back into the grooves. I managed to do this, but I had to be very careful about not rubbing any of the paint off of the face because I didn't clear coat the face. But once the face was back on, I was able to get the metal shell reassembled onto the chassis. Once everything fit perfectly, I was able to put a little bit of hot glue inside the two holes where the rivets used to be. This Mavis model isn't going to be played with. It will most likely be in a display box, so it doesn't have to be screwed on super tight. A little bit of hot glue in each hole will suffice. After much planning, trial and error, and patience, I finally completed my ERTL Mavis restoration. I believe this toy is now better than new, and the majority of it is still original. I love the railway style face. I am also very pleased with the white lining on the side plates and handlebars. You may have noticed the Greek letter Omega under Mavis's nameplate. I decided to do something unique for my restoration custom, since Mavis was the last character in the last book created by the Reverend Audrey. I decided to pay tribute to that history with my own custom Mavis. I hope this video has given you some practical steps and inspired you to do your own ERTL Thomas restoration or custom. If you would like to see more like this, please like and comment below. As I get time, I would love to do more of these projects and share them with you. Well, I hope you enjoyed this step-by-step video of how I brought my childhood ERTL Mavis toy back to life. Thank you for watching.